pervasive, seems to be expanding rapidly in public life, and therefore unbelief must not really be important. Now, some Europeans might disagree too, although they would object that religiosity has shriveled and now seems almost socially irrelevant outside of Muslim immigrant communities, and therefore unbelief doesn't matter. Well, the fact that unbelief seems important for opposite reasons, and that merely within the confines of Western culture, should give us pause before we consign unbelief to history's bulging dustbin. No, the fundamental stance that unbelievers share, the conviction that the everyday world of matter and energy and their interactions is either all that exists or all that matters. That fundamental stance that all unbelievers share is inescapably significant. Now let's do a little thought experiment. Consider for a moment how important it would be if unbelievers' naturalistic worldview were definitely proven wrong. Imagine just for the sake of argument, now stick with me here. Imagine just for the sake of argument that the core contentions of Christian monotheism were somehow demonstrated to be correct beyond any possibility of question. If the universe really is intentionally designed and the designer knows and cares for each of us, if we are truly the vessels for immortal souls that will know eternities of ecstasy or pain determined by how we behave during our eye-blink sojourns on this earth, if all of this is true, then the knowledge that it is true would be the most important item of knowledge any human being could possess. If Christianity were right, no scientific discovery, no mathematical theorem, no secret to success, no avowal of love could ever matter as much as the knowledge that gave the true key to eternity. But okay, let's turn this over on the other side. Imagine for a moment that we unbelievers are correct, that there is no supernatural, no cosmic designer, no life eternal. If that is true, then the most important piece of knowledge that any religious believer could ever possess would be the knowledge that his or her faith is groundless. Denied that knowledge, ardent believers, perhaps we should call them misbelievers, will just go on squandering the precious hours of the only lives they have, pursuing otherworldly rewards that will never, can never be theirs. If unbelief is true, countless misbelievers are stunting their only lives in tragic and essentially irremediable ways. That is one reason why unbelief matters very much. Or consider this. Across our world, billions of people embrace one religion or another. Tens of billions of person hours, hundreds of billions of dollars are devoted each year to affairs of faith. How much might the human prospect have been improved if this energy and these resources had been even partially redirected toward improving the human prospect in this world? What technological innovations do we live without today? What medical breakthroughs remain undiscovered? What dazzling philosophical and artistic conceptions remain unconceived? If unbelievers are right and no religion is true, why wait another moment before striving to deflect so much human passion and wealth into channels at whose end some real benefit can result? Unbelief, I conclude, matters very much. Its contentions, its implications, and its history merit study. Its findings deserve respect and broader advocacy. Now, if I've succeeded in my work as editor of the new Encyclopedia of Unbelief, I hope that it has done some small justice to the importance of its subject. And I hope it will assist unbelievers in learning more about their movement, its rich history, and its place in the tapestry of our society. Perhaps, too, it will aid in liberating a few more human beings from the seductions of misbelief. Or at least that's how I conclude my editor's introduction in the book. Well, I'd like to close here with a brief discussion of the new encyclopedia's Canadian content. Actually, someone told me that that's a legal requirement for anyone from the U.S. coming here to Canada to talk about anything, so I figured I'd better toe the line. Well, one of my goals in assembling this work was to improve on the international coverage that had been given in the 1985 encyclopedia. That included expanding the coverage of Canada for, I just want to lay this on the line, I'm one of the 8% of people in the U.S. who know that Canada is another country. And I've known it for a long time. I just want to get that out there. Well, I'm happy to say that we did a pretty good job, I think, of increasing our coverage of Canada. Not only that, in the course of expanding that coverage, some of our contributors were able to add in a small way toward preserving this nation's free-thought historical heritage. Now, the new encyclopedia treated Canadian topics principally through two major survey articles. The one on Unbelief in Anglophone Canada was written by Christopher DiCarlo, and the one on Unbelief in Francophone Canada was written by the Montreal-based activist Jacques Rouland. In addition, there were individual biographical entries profiling significant activists including Charles Watts, Kate Eunice Watts, Marshall Gauvin, and others. Now, if these names are unfamiliar to you, relax, they're unfamiliar to most Canadians, which is precisely why the new encyclopedia was able to make its little contribution to expanding Canadian free thought history. Most popular accounts of religious skepticism in Canada begin in 1941 with the formation in Montreal of the earliest precursor of the Humanist Association of Canada. This pioneer group enjoyed the official patronage of Lord Bertrand Russell and also of Brock Chisholm, the Canadian psychiatrist who served as the first director of the World Health Organization. Chisholm also holds the record for the most outspokenly critical comment a prominent Canadian ever uttered against Santa Claus. Yes, he told a U.S. magazine that he thought believing in the jolly old elf endangered young minds. And it was the thing that people asked him the last question at press conferences about for the rest of his life. But I digress. Well, we did have the precursor. It became the Humanist Association of Canada. Its next great advance came in conjunction with Henry Morgenthaler's serial prosecutions for performing abortions during the 1960s and 70s. Now, this ultimately led to the 1988 ruling of the Canadian Supreme Court, which essentially did away with Canada's abortion laws. Now, this is all fascinating history, but it doesn't seem like it's the beginning. The way we rediscovered some of that beginning is a fascinating story in itself. Now, why did we think there was missing activity? And the reason was that the latter, about 3 decades of the 19th century, are known as the golden age of free thought. They were a time of intense activity, free thought publishing, organizing, throughout the English-speaking world. Except, it seemed, in Canada. Now, how much activity was going on at that point? Well, let's see. In the United States, the agnostic orator Robert Greene Ingersoll was crisscrossing the country. He would fill the largest theaters of his day by delivering lectures 3 to 4 hours long. Think about that, a lecture 3 to 4 hours long. And how do you know I'm not going to do another one? But people wanted to hear Ingersoll for 3 and 4 hours. He spoke on topics ranging from science to Shakespeare to, oh yes, why God did not exist and church teachings about eternal punishment were morally repugnant. Ingersoll was known as the Great Agnostic. He was widely regarded as North America's foremost public speaker in an era when public oratory was a primary means of education and entertainment. It's believed that over his 30-year lecturing career, he was seen and heard by more people than would see or hear any other human being until the advent of motion pictures and radio. During those years, Ingersoll was an officer at one time or another in most of the half-dozen small but vibrant atheist and freethinker organizations that existed across the United States. In England, too, there was great ferment. The late 19th century marked the formation of England's two great freethinking organizations, the Rationalist Press Association and the National Secular Society. The reformer George Jacob Holyoake was active. He actually coined the word secularism. And there was an atheist MP-elect named Charles Bradlaugh who conducted an ultimately successful multi-year campaign to be allowed to take his seat in Parliament, although he refused to swear an oath of office. Ultimately, Parliament bowed before the stubbornness of his riding, which just kept re-electing him. So there was an awful lot of activity. There's similar ferment in New Zealand, in Australia, and yet in Canada, the record seemingly is silent. So what was going on in Canada? Did atheism or humanism or free thought in Canada really have their start only in 1941? Chris DiCarlo and I were starting to think so when a delightful discovery came from an unexpected quarter, namely England. Now, Holyoake and Bradlaugh may have been the most famous English freethinkers, but taken together, the several members of the Watts family made as large a contribution. Charles Watts, the family patriarch, founded Watts and Company, which would become one of England's two dominant freethought publishers. His son, Charles Albert Watts, was a lecturer for the National Secular Society and also edited Bradlaugh's newspaper, the National Reformer. After a disagreement with Bradlaugh, the younger Watts and his wife, the socialite and activist Kate Eunice Watts, settled in Toronto beginning in 1883. Now, I learned about all of this from Barbara Smoker, the indefatigable freethought activist who is sometimes called England's Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Smoker was co-writing a new Encyclopedia entry on Kate Eunice Watts. She was assisted by research librarian Virginia Clark, an American widow who had moved to London to do volunteer work at feminist and freethought libraries. Well, when Smoker wrote me a letter saying that she and Clark had traced two members of the prominent Watts family to Canada, I immediately advised Chris DiCarlo, who was then working on his survey article on unbelief in Anglophone Canada. Now, Chris and I had already spent some time decrying the rarity of historical material on Canada's 19th century freethought heritage, if there was one. Well, Smoker and Clark kept digging into the life of Kate Eunice Watts, and a forgotten portrait of Canadian freethought emerged. Mr. and Mrs. Watts had emigrated to Toronto in 1883, following a successful lecture before the Toronto Secular Society the year before. So there was a Toronto Secular Society. The Wattses, husband and wife, threw themselves into expanding Canadian secularism. In 1888, Charles Albert Watts petitioned the Canadian government for permission to charter a secular thought publishing company. The government refused on grounds that the company's goals were contrary to the public welfare. Undeterred, Watts launched a new magazine, Secular Thought, and since he couldn't incorporate, he just published it as a sole proprietor. And it was published regularly from 1888 to around 1909. Now, as for Kate Eunice Watts, she accompanied her husband on barnstorming speaking tours across Canada and became an activist and an author in her own right. In Toronto, she published several pamphlets, including one titled Reasons for Not Accepting Christianity. She also published a book here called Christianity Defective and Unnecessary. The Wattses returned to London in 1891, having left their mark on organized Canadian freethought, and Kate Eunice Watts went on to become a celebrated actress on the London stage. Well, this information, at least up to the part about the London stage, prompted Chris DiCarlo into some further research. And he found that another organization, the Freethinkers of Canada, had already been active when the Wattses arrived. Freethinkers of Canada had held a successful conference in Toronto in the fall of 1888, the same year Charles Charles Albert Watts tried so unsuccessfully to register his company. So working across the U.S.-Canada border and across the Atlantic, Krista Carlo, Barbara Smoker, Virginia Clark, and I were able to bring a little bit of Canada's 19th century freethought heritage back into the spotlight of history. It's one of my favorite memories of my work on the new Encyclopedia, other than sending that funeral arrangement. And it was also a very proud accomplishment for Virginia Clark, who died unexpectedly only 1 week after completing her research for the article. Well, from stalking one contributor on the streets of downtown Corning, to prodding another with the aforementioned funeral arrangement, to watching brilliant contributors on 2 continents bring Canada's early freethought heritage back to light, editing the new Encyclopedia of Unbelief has been a once-in-a-lifetime experience. At least it will be once in a lifetime, so long as I stick to my resolve never to undertake a project like this again. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm going to go back to writing 500-page science fiction novels. It's way easier.
I believe the microphone at the side is working, so if you want to ask a question, just go up to the side, and I'm sure you'll be willing to field questions. No
This
questions?
is the Center for Inquiry, so I expect questions.
Inquire! Inquire!
Yes, could you come to the microphone, please?
Oh.
Yeah, they're videoing, and if you don't ask the question on the microphone, no one will hear it except us.
I've never used the microphone before, so this is my first time. I don't know if
Lift it up.
you can take it. You can lift it up. Lift it up. Okay.
To your kisser.
You're there.
Okay. Since I may not have my hands on that encyclopedia anytime soon, I was just wondering, is there any, what's the does it mean does it mean that you separated any religion, residues or any, anything that is related to religion is completely and utterly, religion free? What does that mean?
No, actually rather the opposite. We have a lot of features that talk about religion, but from the perspective of persons who have given up religion. So we have articles on Christianity and unbelief, how the various Christian churches have responded to unorthodox or heretical people or unbelievers in their midst, when unbelievers have been honored within the church councils, when they've been persecuted, things along that line. We have an article on Islam and unbelief, which features a lot fewer examples where unbelievers are honored in the church councils, oddly. But we have a lengthy article, and all kidding aside, probably the best piece for its size I've ever seen. It's a large article, but as compared to whole books on this topic, it's pretty short in scope, on the arguments for and against the existence of God. So basically, this is a reference work that attempts to cover everything having to do with the ideas and the activities and the movements of people who have said no to religion. And necessarily that's involved in providing a good deal of background on the particular religious ideas.
Okay.
By the way, if any of you also who are feeling bad about the prospect of not having an encyclopedia in your hands anytime soon, it's always legal to go up to the librarians at your local public library or your university library and ask that they acquire it. And those of you who have academic connections may, in fact, be able to put something in official through your department or whatever the case may be. When I left Krista Carlo in Oshawa today, he was making magical gestures and causing it to be ordered by university libraries across Canada. Well, at least from Oshawa to Guelph. I thought that was pretty impressive. Yes?
You mentioned that the encyclopedia would be a good book to have in libraries. Has the Vatican Library requested a copy?
I don't know. I'll have to check. Because they should. I know they can afford it.
I'm sure of that. what I was going to suggest, if they haven't, it might be a good idea to send them a complimentary copy.
You know, as a former Catholic, I just can't bring myself to compliment them.
Well, not in that sense. But also, it might be to send. I know it'd be pretty expensive to send every church and synagogue, etc., a copy. But if a complimentary copy to the central offices, if there is such, for these different religions, just send them a complimentary copy.
Well, actually, I know. Unfortunately, Prometheus Books is a for-profit publisher. In some years that's a reality, in other years it's a goal. But,
Perhaps you could persuade somebody to donate it to these organizations.
I would certainly welcome that. One thing I know we have done, they did a mailing to every seminary and theological school in the U.S. and Canada with the headline, "Know Thy Enemy." And I understand it's resulted in a fair number of orders, so...
You just never know. Some of these top hierarchy people may be persuaded.
They may be persuaded already. I had my undergraduate education at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a Jesuit school. And at that point, there was still a substantial population of Jesuit priests residing on the campus. And I would say that at least a third of them were atheists. They thought the church did good works and was wonderful social glue, or they just couldn't figure out what else they'd start doing at age 56 or whenever it was. So yes, there are folks like us there in the corridors of Vatican power. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question has to do with something that I thought you presented, which was really interesting, to show that Canada really has had a free thought tradition, and this has been a feature of our country for a long time, but there hasn't been a great deal of noise made about it. And I'm embarrassed that I didn't know very much at all about the history in this country. Do you think that there's a sociological reason for it? I mean, are Canadians too polite to go telling everybody why they're non-believers?
Actually, I think the interesting factor is how the 19th century activism that there really was happened to vanish so totally from the historical record. I mean, basically, one of the things that sparked the golden age of free thought was the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. And here was when it first came out, it hit the educated English-speaking world like a thunderclap. The Christian churches did not have any of the faulty but impressive sounding arguments that they would compose to use against Darwin in coming decades. And when that book first hit, it was a big dose of everything you learned in Bible class was wrong. And it caused an awful lot of people to make a pretty abrupt jump into free thinking. And that's this is the period where you see the enormous rises in free thought activism, publishing, group membership in all of the English-speaking countries, and including in Canada, that had been lost. What's really puzzling is that even though with the outbreak of World War I and the Russian Revolution and the fears of Bolshevism, basically any left-leaning social reform movement that could be linked to anarchism or Bolshevism became persona non grata, and the free thought movement suffered horribly. The thing is, in England and the US and Australia and New Zealand, there was enough of a remnant to maintain institutional memory of what there had been during the Golden Age. And when interest in free thought began to expand again in the 1960s, it wasn't something that everybody was talking about, but any free thinker who cared to could root around a little bit and learn about what the golden age of free thought had been like. Not in Canada. And I think the most interesting question here is if free thought received a body blow in all the other English-speaking countries, why was it actually flatlined here? Why wasn't there anybody to keep the tradition alive in the 20s and 30s?
That's a much more eloquent way of stating my question, I think.
Well, I'm an editor. I state other people's questions. Thank you.
You said you contributed some articles yourself. I was just wondering if maybe you could read like a little excerpt from an article that you're particularly proud of, so we can kind of see how it's.
I do not know this person. I never met her before tonight. Well, let's see here. Now, this is going to be tough because for my speech, I've reached the age where I use really big type. New Encyclopedia does not use really big type. Let's see here. Looking for United States Unbelief in, which I wound up writing. Okay, we were talking before about the way that the free thought tradition had been preserved, although at a lower level after the Golden Age. And this is read a brief passage from United States Unbelief in, where I talk about that. We're at the dawning of the 20th century. Robert Ingersoll has just died. World War I is in the offing, and the Golden Age of free thought was considered by most workers to be over. Still, organized free thought, which began to refer to itself as atheism, rather than having the word hurled at it by its enemies, did not want for advocates. Among the leading names in this period were Clarence Darrow, Emmanuel Haldeman Julius, Joseph McCabe, Charles Lee Smith, Joseph Lewis, Marshall Gauvin, who was a Canadian, by the way, James Hervey Johnson, Madeleine Murray O'Hare, Gordon Stein, and Paul Kurtz. Also noteworthy were humanist and religious humanist movements whose thrust leaned toward unbelief. And here's an interesting, let's see, just one brief one. The strange people, who, and some of them were genuinely very strange, who kept the torch alive in U.S. free thought during the early middle 20th century. Charles Lee Smith was an Arkansas-born lawyer who moved to New York and in 1925 founded the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism, also known as the 4 A's. Perpetually undercapitalized, the 4 A's achieved some impact through skillful media manipulation, especially with regard to the organization's largely vaporous plan to found atheist groups at vast numbers of American high schools. The 4 A's influenced legendary filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille, who based his last silent picture, The Godless Girl, 1929, on one of the most charismatic 4 A's promoters, the Los Angeles-based child atheist evangelist Queen Silver. Smith also debated and conducted bombastic campaigns against creationism. In 1937, he acquired the faded periodical The Truth Seeker from its aged second editor, George MacDonald. Influenced by associate editor Woolsey Teller, Smith elbowed the paper toward social conservatism, anti-Semitism, racism, advocacy of eugenics, and, not surprisingly, obscurity. Smith died in 1964, passing the failing paper's editorship to James Hervey Johnson. Okay, who came in knowing that?
Okay, before we continue, could we just pause for a moment while we change tape?